Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com, a new podcast where we bring you news, insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Ronan Murphy and I'm joined today by a whole host of characters: Paul Macdonald, Peter Staunton, Robin Bairner, Carlo Garganese, myself, and unfortunately no Duncan Castles this week because he's on his holidays, enjoying himself, sunning himself, whatever it is that he does after the busy transfer period has ended. He's keeping himself busy, but I'm delighted to start things off today by having Paul Macdonald on the show. Welcome, Paul.
Hello, Ronan. How's things?
Very good. And yourself?
I'm good, thank you, mate.
Good. I imagine things have died down a little in the transfer world since the end of the transfer window. It probably hasn't been as busy, and that's probably why Duncan has decided to take some time for himself.
Yeah, I'd love to get a little holiday myself, mate, to be honest. But Chelsea are still doing things. They're still buying and selling and loaning guys and all sorts of stuff going on. But for the rest of the world, it's kind of calmed down a little bit. So it gives us a chance to reflect on the kind of trends of the summer, what happened, why it happened, and what it could mean for next year.
Yeah, and obviously the big trend and why you're on the first part of the show today is to talk about the Premier League. And it was the only league to spend over €1 billion in transfer fees, and it went even higher than €2 billion in transfer fees. So would it be fair to say it was a busy summer for the Premier League, or a bit less busy than in previous years?
Busy, but not as busy. If you look at a year-on-year comparison, we're probably talking, if you include the January transfer window in it, the January transfer window this year was notoriously quiet. I think there was only about 100 million of business done. So if you combined the January and summer transfer windows this year versus last, you're talking the spend is down like nearly €1 billion year on year. So that's an interesting comparison. Now, there are mitigating factors for that. I think teams are just more wary of spending big money on transfers than ever before because of, well, whatever you want to call it, previously FFP, now PSR, future regulations that UEFA will bring in, future regulations that the Premier League are looking to bring in. Teams just don't want to spend that kind of money. And also there's just the inherent risk involved in big transfer fees if you don't get it right. Everyone, of course, rather than Chelsea, who continue to scorch the earth in the transfer market. But those deals are very much an anomaly in a market where, even though they've still spent quite a lot of money, over 2.3 billion in total, the amount of money that they brought in was significant this summer, so that the actual net spend of the Premier League is only somewhere in the region of €650 million. And even teams that notoriously didn't do very well in the past at getting market value for their players when they sell them, did okay this summer. Like even Man United managed to raise over €100 million selling players like Wan-Bissaka and McTominay and Hannibal and these kind of fringe. But obviously the Mason Greenwood transfer, the controversial transfer to Spain. To Marseille, not Spain. These deals have meant that even clubs that notoriously didn't do well selling players in the past have actually done okay this summer and has brought the net spend of the league closer to equilibrium than ever before.
Yeah, I suppose we're kind of seeing that kind of reluctance to spend big on any player. There was very few players across Europe that kind of got big money this summer, and Dominic Solanke was the biggest one in the Premier League, which if you had have told anyone a year ago that would be the biggest transfer for a Premier League club, Spurs spending the most, you'd be very surprised at that.
I think people are mainly surprised about how much Spurs have spent in general since Ange's came in. I mean, obviously they raised money for Harry Kane when he went to Bayern Munich last summer, but apart from that deal, Ange has been really backed in the transfer market, spent nearly close to €350 million on players last summer and this summer, and it's not really going to plan for him so far, so he might find himself under pressure quite quickly because of that. And as you say, Solanke, the biggest deal, I think that's very much reflective of the market. I think he was overpriced in the market just because there's a dearth of centre forwards, and Tottenham felt that they had to ultimately really replace Kane, which they didn't do last year, so I think they had to pay a premium to get Solanke. That remains to be seen whether that will be a good deal, but it is very much reflective of a tempered market across Europe where teams are kind of more willing to take 3 or 4 stabs at guys in the 15 to 20 million range, and hopefully one of those pays off for them, then going all out for a 70 to 80 million signing that if it fails, then it really fails and it reflects badly on everybody from sporting director to manager to club. So that's what we've seen, a more broad spend in terms of guys in and around that €20 million range being bought, and clubs looking to just get one of those gems from that kind of spread of spend rather than going all out for one gangbuster signing.
Yeah, I think we can kind of see it in the way maybe Brighton spent the money, because they were the second biggest spenders this summer in the Premier League after Chelsea. And if you look at all their kind of incomings, they all seem to have 30 million as the transfer fee. So it seems to be that this is kind of the upper mark that we're seeing on transfers. And Brighton, big spenders, but you mentioned earlier on the show, Chelsea have been the biggest spenders, and they continue to spend, and you kind of wonder what's going on there, or do you have any insight into what the long-term or short-term plan is for Chelsea?
But just to touch on the Brighton side of it, Brighton is almost an identikit of how you would want to run the club, because they made significant transfer profits over the last couple of seasons, selling guys like Caicedo to Chelsea, and McAllister to Liverpool, and other signing sales like that. So they're spending money that they've earned this summer, and don't get me wrong, they spent a lot of it. Nearly €160 million spent in the end on all the players that they brought in. But that's them basically taking a punt on the market this year and saying now's the right time to go and spend this money again. And they've spread the net wide. Guys like Minte from Newcastle for 30 odd million. They signed Rutter from Leeds for about the same fee. Kadioglu came from Turkey as well for again run about that same range. So they have spread the net wide and tried to land one or two gems in amongst the good talent that they already had there. To focus on Chelsea, your guess is as good as mine, Ronan. I don't really know. There's rumours and there's conspiracies and there's various thoughts about an overriding strategy here. I don't really know what it is. Certainly other finance people that I see speaking about this, they don't know what it is. I don't, other than the kind of the quite blatant gaming of the system that they've done in certain cases, whether it be selling the hotel to another part of the business to kind of make PSR, try to sell the women's team to themselves, and also the transfer shenanigans that were on this summer with clubs selling each other players so they could meet PSR by the fact that if you sell a young player on your books, you can bank 100% of the profit of that player in that accounting year. Whereas if you buy from another club, then you can amortise that transfer over the length of the deal. So there was a lot of young talent being sold to other clubs for exorbitant fees, but then they were buying players back from that club in order to kind of appease that other team's books. So if you look at the deal that Newcastle and Nottingham Forest did for Elliot Anderson, went to Nottingham Forest for I think 40 million, somewhere in that region, and in return they signed Vladikomos, the goalkeeper from Nottingham Forest, for 25 million. So what that allowed Newcastle to do was to bank 100% of the Elliot Anderson fee in that accounting year, because he was a homegrown talent and had no costs, and then they can amortise the 25 million of Vladikomos across the 5 years of his contract. So that comes out to be a net profit of 36 million. There's quite a lot of that going on, and Chelsea were certainly a big part of it, and they, by no means the only one, but of all the teams that were kind of had the fingers in all the kind of pies trying to get round various legislation, Chelsea basically had a stab at everything, and I don't really know what the end game is. I don't really understand why you would buy so many young guys, and then ultimately some of them are not even playing for the club. They're not even got any chance of playing for the club. And indeed, they tried to sell a young talent to their other club within their multi-club ownership, Strasbourg. And the only reason they didn't do it on deadline day was because of the fear of the ramifications of the optics of what the deal would look like, because they were selling a guy who I think who'd only played 15 minutes for the club for a 5 million profit. And it was only because of what people thought that deal might look like, rather than actually anything tactical or anything long-term planning. Says a lot about what's going on there. And I think if you look at the news about a so-called civil war between Todd Bowley and Igbali and the guys at the top end of Chelsea, there is no joined-up thinking there. And from a Chelsea fan perspective, you can only hope that at the very least Enzo Maresca on the bench might have some joined-up thinking, because he's had a lot of players or to work with, and he's made it quite clear the ones that he does want to work with. So from that perspective, there is encouragement that he has a strategy on the pitch that he is going to try and employ, even if the people in the boardroom don't really have one behind them.
Yeah, and I suppose the opposite of that is seeing how little Liverpool spent, or how few kind of transfers made, much to the annoyance of, I think, some of the Liverpool fans who were looking for particular players in particular positions. But then they only ended up signing one player this year and one for the future, kind of as big money signings, and that kind of went against the trend of what we've seen teams do in the long run. And I suppose, is that a kind of a better indicator of the market and the way the market's gone than Chelsea's wild spending here, there and everywhere?
Yes, I would say that Arne Slot seems to be one of the more methodical coaches and managers out there, and I think what he has done is decided to go into Liverpool and assess the squad as a whole before he makes any snap decisions to go and spend money. I think in some cases that decision looks really good. I mean, if you look at the performances of Ryan Gravenberch this season so far, I don't think anybody expected him to look so good in that position based on his performances last season. But Slot has given him a chance, given him a summer to kind of adapt to his system and his tactics, and he looks like a £50 million signing at the moment that they would have made anyway. So in that respect, Slot has taken a long, hard look at the squad and decided, do we really need guys in these positions, or do we have people already in the club that can perform the role that I want them to perform in my system? And apart from the Nottingham Forest snafu at home, where they didn't really play well, they are pretty well stocked in a lot of positions, and they have options across the squad. Now, whether they can return to the Champions League in the 8 matches in the group stages means that they're really put under pressure, and the squad has shown up to be a little light. That remains to be seen. But certainly for the start of this season, it was refreshing to see a coach say, okay, let me judge what I've got to work with here first before we go into the transfer market and try and buy guys that might not be better than I already have in the organisation.
Yeah, and I suppose we'll see kind of, there's obviously links for moves in January or next year for various players to Liverpool. We'll see kind of how he assesses the squad, how the squad copes with all these extra games, whether they have long-term injuries, who they need to replace, and the future of kind of big players at the club. There's lots of contract talk or speculation around the futures of Van Dijk, Alexander-Arnold, Salah, big players like this. But Liverpool, we'll see next year whether they spend money. But do you think that this summer as a whole, the way that the transfer market was this summer, will continue like this, that we won't be seeing any of these 100 million signings or a 70 million signing even? It'll be kind of low across the board?
Yes, is my opinion. I think the market, I mean, you have to be careful when you say this, because there could be some state ownership deal that happens, or it could be the Saudis could go crazy again, or something else could crop up. But it does feel like the Neymar transfer to PSG in 2017 was a line in the sand in terms of what an organisation is willing to spend on one player. I think that given that there's a lot of American money in the Premier League in particular now, and some of it, if not all of it, is in some way private equity backed, private equity doesn't really want to spend money, it wants to make money. And I think we're seeing a lot more prudence in organisations now in terms of trying to get that net spend closer to zero as much as possible. So they will spend money, but they'll try and recoup it as well. And that means a tighter market overall. That teams have to be more succinct in terms of their business, but also in terms of their strategising. They can't just go scattergun. Again, that's why the Chelsea situation is so bizarre, because they're doing the opposite of that. But I think in other cases you're seeing a lot more prudence in the market, a lot more caretaking, and certainly in Europe as well. Like, I think La Liga's spend is way down. There's just not that appetite at the lower end of the league there to go and spend money. And I think whilst we will see a transfer market in the future where there will be spending and there will be players moving from team to team, the days of multiple 100 million transfers in a summer, I think, might be over. But time will tell.
Yeah, it's one to keep an eye on for the future, for certain. And you mentioned La Liga, and we have Peter coming up on the show shortly to talk about La Liga, and then we have the rest of the leagues to cover, the big 5 leagues across Europe. So there's plenty of to talk about on this episode. So thanks for getting us going, Paul.
No problem. Thanks, Ronan.
Now we have Peter Staunton, a European football expert, to speak about La Liga and the transfers that we've seen there this summer. They've spent over €500 million worth of transfer fees so far during the summer, but they had nearly the same amount of outlay. So the net kind of for La Liga was just 7 million. So it's a lot of, not too many ins and outs. And obviously the big talking point was Kylian Mbappe arriving at Real Madrid on a free transfer, but we all know that wasn't really a free transfer, and that there was a lot of signing on money that paid to Kylian Mbappe. So obviously the biggest signing in La Liga this summer was Kylian Mbappe, and I think Real Madrid didn't spend any money on him in the outlay column, but we know his signing on fee was gigantic. So he is obviously the biggest talking point in La Liga in a long time.
Yeah, of course, it's a huge arrival. It's a landmark arrival for La Liga, and of course for Real Madrid. Another Galactico to add to the pile there. But crucially, this time they've not spent the transfer fees that they've spent on Galacticos in the past, be it Beckham, Zidane, Figo, Eden Hazard, if you remember him being a Galactico. All the money is going to Mbappe essentially, rather than going to a selling club. So it looks like the very, very, very top end of the market, where the players, they're the ones that are in control of their own destinies. They're the ones that hold all the leverage in negotiations. We could see a move at the very, very top end towards almost like an Americanized system, where players are moving for no transfer fees, but essentially banking the equivalent of a transfer fee into their own back pockets. So Mbappe's his gross salary, although it's big, it's not outlandish by Real Madrid terms. I think it's around 15 million a year. But you mentioned the signing on fee. It's anything approaching 150 million euros payable until 2029. So it means that his wages will be topped up to over €500,000 a week. So PSG losing Kylian Mbappe for nothing, which is a disaster, and any money that they could have banked on him if he was still under any sort of contract is going straight to Kylian himself. A bit of an indifferent start, it must be said, for Mbappe at Real Madrid. There's been some chatter that his arrival has caused a little bit of disturbance between Rodrigo and Bellingham. Obviously, Endrick's not got on the pitch as much as he would have liked in the first few weeks of the campaign. Mbappe has kept his numbers up largely through penalty kicks. There's still some sorting out to do to get him properly integrated in this team. But if they can do that, they'll enjoy the benefit of Mbappe in his peak years. He's only 25 years old, still only 25 years old, and he's there until 2029. So, there's a great chance for Real Madrid to lead themselves into this new era with a new stadium behind them as well, with Mbappe as the flagship player.
Yeah, obviously they decided not to make the same move with Lenny Yoro. They were hoping they could get him next summer for free, but they wouldn't pay as much as Manchester United, and that's probably Real Madrid being smart in the transfer market, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I think so. I think Liverpool were another team that were linked with Lenny Yoro, and given the finances that were involved, I think Liverpool and Real Madrid both had a look and were willing to do a deal at a certain price with certain wages. But once Man United made their interest known, they were kind of, I wouldn't say blown out the water, but they decided to, keep their powder dry. It's not a position that's an immediate priority for Real Madrid. They seem to be well covered as long as everybody stays fit. And likewise, Liverpool, of course, not that we're going to talk too much about Liverpool now, but they'll have more decisions to make next summer, what to do with Kwanzaa, whether they'll renew Van Dijk. But yeah, it certainly won't be Lenny Yoro going there.
No, and we have to wait and see how he gets on at Manchester United, because obviously his dream move hasn't really started off too well. But another dream move was probably Hansi Flick moving to Barcelona. He's the new manager there, the new head coach, but he hasn't been given a lot of money to spend. And how have Barcelona kind of got around the fact that they have no money? Everybody knows they have no money, and what have they kind of done to change things and start this Flick era in Barcelona?
Barcelona continues to be one of the most baffling clubs around. They seem to do everything wrong when it comes to conducting their transfer business. They'll leave a lot of their own players unhappy with how they treat them when it comes to getting rid of them. And yet here they are sitting pretty at the top of the league. They really show all the symptoms of a club doing everything incorrectly and how not to run a football club, and look at them being top of the league. So it's a really hard one to make sense of. Not really any money to spend this summer, but they did manage to get a deal done for Dani Olmo, who came back home, as it were, from RB Leipzig. He had a 60 million release clause, which was very, very attractive for a lot of teams around Europe. But Barcelona, I suppose, they had that hometown lure for Dani Olmo. They managed to get that one over the line. I think it was an initial 55 million to be paid in installment plus some bonuses. That was enough for Leipzig to say, okay, on you go. And he started well. I think he got 3 goals in his first few matches. But of course, long-standing issues with Dani Olmo's injuries, and he's already been injured, and it looks like he's going to have 6 weeks out. So they've got rid of some fringe players, Araujo, Marc Giu, who's gone to Chelsea, Mika Faye, who's gone to Rennes, Chidi Riyad, who's gone to Real Betis. Gundogan, obviously, who's gone back to Manchester City, helps them save a load of money on the wages. So they've really weakened their squad, brought in around 40 million plus the salary savings for that lot. Their only outlay was on Olmo, as I said. But how much of the season he's actually going to be fit for remains to be seen. Basket case of a club, Barcelona. I think their initial offer for Olmo was described as surreal by RB Leipzig. But like I said, the club president looked to manage to get that one over the line through a combination of asking players politely to leave, through pulling more levers. Very, very disordered and confusing situation at Barcelona.
Perhaps that surreal transfer bid they made was more close to the estimated transfer value that Dani Olmo had when he moved, which is 31.74 million. So maybe RB Leipzig were just asking too much money.
Well, the release clause is the release clause, and the club are very, very entitled to point to that. But I saw it described in one meme that Barcelona had offered 1 million a year for 60 years or something like that. But obviously, it's not going to be like that. But the initial upfront fee that they offered was very, very low. And Leipzig, for one of their most important players, when he is fit, I should say, because he's a very talented player, but quite injury prone, they're entitled to ask for that. Certainly more than, I think, the 20-25 initial outlay that Barcelona were originally offering. But yeah, they've had so many issues over the years, whether that's the money that they paid to Lionel Messi over the term of his contract before that one expired. The unbelievable salary that they're paying Robert Lewandowski. I still think he's the third highest paid player in the world or something like that. Ferran Torres, Ansu Fati, all on massive money. They're trying to push Frankie de Jong out of the club. They deferred his wages during COVID, and now they owe him a lot of money. And I think he's estimated to be raking in about 500,000 a week based on what he's owed. And obviously Barca are doing everything they can to push him out of the club so they can make more space in the budget for adding extra players. They haven't been able to do so much over the course of this summer, only adding Dani Olmo. Like I said, Hansi Flick has them sitting pretty at the top of the league right now. So, maybe all these football experts who like to swallow laptops for a living are all wrong and Barca have got it right.
Yeah, perhaps that's the case. And someone that definitely people don't consider a football or a laptop expert would be Diego Simeone. But amazingly, the only other team to spend over 50 million, the biggest spenders in La Liga this summer were Atletico Madrid. They spent 183 million on transfers. And looking at the kind of whole fees for La Liga at home as a whole, that's over a third of the total outlay for La Liga was spent by Atletico Madrid.
Yeah, absolutely massive money spent at Atletico Madrid. And I think what it says to me, you given the age profile of the guys that brought in, your Sorlots, Lenormands, Gallagher and Alvarez, they're looking for immediate success at Atletico Madrid. There's none of this, what Real Madrid do or what Liverpool do, which is buying for the future. They're definitely buying for the here and now. 95 million Julian Alvarez. I mean, that is a groundbreaking deal. For a player who, some might say is not exactly at the top level, but that's a huge outlay up front. And he forms a new strike partnership with Alexander Sorloth, who I think was the second highest goal scorer in La Liga last season when he was playing for Villarreal. Might be vaguely familiar to some Premier League fans, actually. Sorloth from an unsuccessful spell a few years back. Conor Gallagher then, of course, from Chelsea. Chelsea, like Frankie de Jong at Barcelona, were doing all they could to get rid of Conor Gallagher, and he's finally found it, I would say, a home that suits him really, really well at Atletico Madrid. And then Robin Lenormand, who has been one of the most consistent defenders around, I would say, in Spain over the last 3 or 4 seasons, and also now a European champion with Spain after their success in the Euros over the summer. So you would say they've added some quality to the team, and we've seen those guys play in the first team already. And they're doing quite well at Atletico at the start of the season. I think they've only conceded 2 goals, 5 games unbeaten, 4 in a row without conceding a goal. So, I think they'll be quite happy. I think Simeone will be quite happy where he's put the team at the start of this season. One of the questions that was asked when they were spending 95 on Alvarez and then maybe another 100 million on the other 3, Lenormand, Sorloth and Gallagher, is how can they afford it? Although there's sort of night and day between Real Madrid's revenues and Atletico Madrid's revenues, they're still a very rich club in Spanish football terms, comfortably the third richest club. Obviously, they've moved to that new stadium, the Metropolitano, a few years ago. So that's increased their revenues on a match day. They've been in the Champions League now for more than a decade in a row, which is a remarkable achievement for Simeone. They've qualified for the Club World Cup next year. That's going to add money to their coffers. Over the summer, there was a new share issue, which brought in another 70 million. They've saved massive money on wages with some of the outgoings. I'm talking about players like Memphis Depay, Alvaro Morata, Sal Niguez is gone on loan. João Felix is obviously gone. Savic is gone. Mario Hermoso, Soyuncu, Gabriel. All of those guys have been cleared off the wage structure, and they've also managed to bank some fees for players in that bracket. People like Soyuncu, obviously João Felix has gone for decent money to Chelsea. Omar Dion has gone to Porto, not for as much as he was rumoured to go for Chelsea, but they still managed to bank a fee for him. And also Morata, who's gone to AC Milan for a bit of a knockdown fee, it must be said. But obviously his wages were extortionate. So they took plenty of space in the budget, plenty of space in the salary budget, and I think they've done good work over the summer, reducing the average age of the squad and giving themselves a team that they think could compete again in the Champions League. Very, very disappointing last year when they got eliminated by Borussia Dortmund, and also in La Liga, where they've sort of been miles off the pace over the last few years.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether this kind of short-term planning will work for Diego Simeone and whether they can get results, because like you said, some of these players are later in their careers or the later halves of their careers, and we'll see how similarly Hansi Flick will have to make do with what his one big signing and the teenagers that Barcelona keep giving 100 games to every season, and see what happens there. But thanks very much for your time today, Peter. I hope our listeners enjoyed your insight on Spanish football.
Thank you very much for having me, Ronan, anytime.
Next up, we have Robin Bairner, who's a Ligue 1 expert and knows all things French football. So he's here to chat about the French transfer market, which actually wasn't as busy as some of the other leagues. And we've said it already on the show that transfers in general haven't been as busy, but the Ligue 1 definitely wasn't. So welcome to the show, Robin.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. And I suppose we'll get started with the fact why that was the case in France, why the French market was not very busy at all this summer. We actually have 4 teams in the top division in France that spent no money whatsoever on transfers, which seems kind of crazy from the outside. Angers, Le Havre, Montpellier and Reims all spent 0 this summer. What was that, Robin?
Yeah, so basically in France there was a huge issue around TV rights. So the TV deal expired in the summer, and there was lots of negotiations about how much they could get. The league continued to knock back offers. They were demanding £1 billion for the current package, and although they were offered several offers, they were very bullish in the fact that they wanted this figure. And they got to the final weeks of the summer and this hadn't arrived. So the clubs basically didn't have a clue how much they would be able to budget for in the transfer market. And the league didn't get anything like as much as they hoped to get. I think it was €500 million in total. So that was half the figure that they had wanted. And clubs were really hamstrung by this. And I think, although you mentioned that there was 4 teams that didn't spend any money at all, I think what was really interesting is the fact that Brest, who have qualified for Europe for the first time and will play in the Champions League for the first time, only managed to spend €12.2 million. And, we're always thinking about how big an influx and how big an impact the Champions League has on these clubs. The fact that they've had a net spend of just over €6 million shows how perilous the finances of French football are. And I think it was also telling that Brest didn't make a whole bunch of signings until the very end of the transfer window too, making a whole bunch of loan deals towards the end of the window and not really signing any sort of marquee players despite having this status as a Champions League team this year.
Yeah, so that's why we kind of saw teams not sign players at all kind of for a lot of...
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it. These teams are very reliant on their the television money. Obviously, the gate money and marketing is also part of it, but television money is a huge part of the part of the deal in France, and these are teams that are coming up into Ligue 1, or they're generally lower ranked Ligue 1 teams that were struggling financially anyway. So to have this sort of double whammy of uncertainty over television money really hasn't helped them, and it has really blocked a whole chunk of the market in France this summer.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of teams in Ligue 1 didn't spend a lot of money, but the anomaly is always going to be PSG because they have different revenue streams, different money coming in. As we mentioned in the podcast a few weeks ago, they seem to be going for a different sort of strategy than we've seen in the past. They're not buying maybe these marquee names, these Marcus Rashford types that they always get linked to. And with Mbappe going, Mbappe going to Lille, and Kylian went somewhere too. With Mbappe leaving, they're obviously on a different route forward now, are they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think PSG are now following a path that a lot of big teams are taking, notably Chelsea, in terms of trying to buy younger players and develop them themselves. So we've seen them sign a couple of teenagers in the form of João Neves from Benfica. They've spent about 60 million euros on him, and also the very highly rated young French winger Désiré Doué, who has arrived from Rennes. And this is a continuation, I suppose, of their transfer policy from last year, when they started to focus on younger players, and particularly younger French players. And the idea is to try and build a more sort of Parisian identity, ideally, but certainly more of a French identity. And obviously João Neves doesn't necessarily fit into this, but they're not going to be dogmatic about it. However, the idea is certainly to reduce the age of their squad. And I think at times last year, certainly when they were in the Champions League latter stages, they actually had a younger average age than Barcelona in terms of their starting 11. So we're looking at a very, very young PSG team that's short of experience, but is very, very high on potential and has some really, thrilling young players in its midst.
So looking at the other teams that spend money, PSG obviously spent big money, 236 million, but the only other team in France who spent over 100 million was Lyon. And looking at the players they brought in a few players from England, actually. Chelea from Southampton, Mangala, Niakate from Nottingham Forest, even brought in Benrahma from West Ham. So is there a no plan behind this, or what do you think might be the plan behind it? It looks very strange from the outside, at least.
Lyon's transfer window has been really strange. I mean, at least a couple of these deals that you've mentioned were loan deals that were conducted in January, which were designed to drive Lyon away from the bottom of the Ligue 1 table, which is where they found themselves for a large part of last season. And they were really successful in the second half of last term. I mean, they just about achieved European football, which, given where they were about this time last year and into October, was absolutely remarkable. So obviously we've seen Benrahma sign, although Mangala signed and then moved on again. And we also saw Ernest Noah sign from Molenbeek and then almost complete a move to Fulham. He apparently broke down in tears during the medical because he didn't want to leave Lyon. So there's been a lot of drama around the transfer window around in Lyon. But like you suggested, there doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of thought in terms of who they've signed. And I don't know if it's a sort of an American thing and me thinking of Todd Bowley at Chelsea, but Lyon's owner's John Textor, who is a part owner of Crystal Palace and has a big say in what's happening at Lyon. And it just seems to be really scattergun. Doesn't seem to be a sort of solid plan behind it, and that's kind of been reflected on the field for Lyon in the early weeks of the season. They've not managed to build on the momentum they gained last year and in particular the second half of last year, and it looks like it could be another tricky season for them.
Yeah, so I imagine we'll have to wait and see how they get on, and with the TV deal in the future, and in January we probably will see this trend continue where French clubs aren't going to spend lots in the market anymore.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And I think, to be honest, it's not just going to be a Ligue 1 problem. I think it's going to be a European problem in general. This could easily be the start of the bursting of the TV bubble, because other television companies will have looked at what's happened in France. They'll have seen that DAZN, who have bought the rights, have struggled to get subscribers, and that IPTV has really sort of dominated the market for people watching Ligue 1 this season. And that's not going to do anybody any favours when it comes to selling their television rights for the league. So it's going to be a real sort of crossroads, I guess, for football and television rights in general. It certainly has been in France, and I can see that spreading to the rest of Europe.
Yeah, well, hopefully for our case and the podcast case, that transfers will continue, maybe just not at the high fees that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks very much for your time, Robin. Much appreciated.
A pleasure.
Next on the podcast, we have the host of the Italian football podcast, which is Carlo Garganese, who's obviously a Serie A expert and a lifelong Juventus fan, or a suffering Juventus fan. I'm not sure what he might call it himself. Hi, Carlo. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, it's almost getting to long-suffering Juventus fan, but I think better times are ahead. Thanks for having me there, Ronan.
Yeah, obviously Serie A was a big mover and shaker in transfers this summer. Well, relative to the other leagues, maybe not relative to times past, but relative to the other leagues, it was the only other league outside the Premier League to come close to €1 billion in spending. And is that because there were a lot of kind of Inter moves, not Inter Milan obviously, but Inter Serie A moves, like the players going from Bologna to Juventus, for example? Is that where the money was spent this summer in Italy?
Well, there's a few clubs that spend big. I mean, Inter, actually, that you mentioned, didn't really do any business at all. They brought in Zielinski and Taremi on free transfers very early. Those were done months ahead of the transfer window, and that was really pretty much it. They did very, very little business, Inter. Whereas other teams are obviously trying to catch up with Inter, because they have been the strongest team in Serie A for a few years now, even though they've only won 2 Serie A titles in the last 4 years. So Juventus really were the team that revolutionised the most, and as you can see, they spent 138 million on. They spent. They actually their net spend actually wasn't that high, because they made 106 million in sales, but they revolutionised the team. I mean, they've got, once their full team is out, it'll be half of their first team really are new players. Douglas Luiz, Kefren Turam, Tune Koopmeiners, which was the biggest signing in Serie A, around 60 million, I think, once bonuses are reached. So Juventus were big spenders. Napoli were the biggest spenders of all. They spent a lot of money because they had the disastrous season. After winning the Scudetto in 22-23, they finished 10th last season. So they had to go out and spend. They spent 151 million, which I'm actually can't believe it got that high. Actually, I'm quite surprised looking at that figure now. And Alessandro Buongiorno, one of the best centre-backs in the league. Romelu Lukaku, of course, 30 million for a 31-year-old. Quite a lot of money. They spent a lot of money on players who are kind of ready now, kind of already established, most of them, or even aging in the cases of Lukaku, Spinazzola. Scott McTominay is not a spring chicken. So Napoli, I think, I'm not sure how well Napoli spent their money. I think they've gone more for short-term gain, Napoli.
Yeah, and I suppose then the short-term gain isn't going to work out for them in the long run, and a big part of that maybe is they were probably hoping for some money from selling their marquee striker, which hasn't kind of come to fruition, and that will kind of probably be a talking point in the future as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you look at it like this, short term, Napoli will probably be happy with their market. Antonio Conte is the new manager, and we know Conte wants ready-made, ready players, and he's in the hole. He's got that, especially with Lukaku, who's already started the season brilliantly under Conte. He looks like the old Lukaku, or the Lukaku that Conte had at Inter already. But if you look at, like I said, the age of the players, that there's no sell-on value with most of the players they've signed. And if you look at the players they've sold, they've only made 7 million in sales. So they've got 144 million net spend this summer, and they, as you said, they failed to sell Victor Osimhen, which is a huge failure, huge failure, because they've known for the best part of a year that he was going to be leaving at the end of the season, and they've not managed to find a buyer when they've had at least 8 or 9 months, at least, probably more, in terms of finding a place for him, and they've not managed to sell him, and they've had to loan him out to Galatasaray. So that's a huge failure, and he can only lose value at Galatasaray as well.
Yeah, I suppose even if he does have a fantastic season there, they're still going to have the same problem of who's going to pay his wages or who's going to pay the asking price that they're looking for him. And it's not like Galatasaray or a team like that can afford him in the long run. And we saw Saudi moves fall through, so it's going to be one to watch, I suppose, this time next year or whatever, or close to the close of the market to see what happens with it. But Juventus, your team, they were the biggest spenders outside of Napoli, 138 million euro spent. And you mentioned the players they brought in, but they look like a better kind of long-term proposition to me, at least. But how do you feel like it yourself, that this is kind of a new Juventus era? Is that what we can expect?
Yeah, it's a new Juventus era in many ways. They're including not just on the sporting side, but financially. Like why they've had a really good window is not because they've improved just because they've improved the team and the squad a lot, which they have done, but it's also, the net spend is not that high, but also they've got the wage bill down. Like they've got a lot of their highest earners off their books. Some of these were left on free transfers, so they didn't make a transfer fee, but they'll still make a big saving each season on the wages. So we're looking at Adrian Rabiot, who was on about €7.5 million a season. Alexandro, who incredibly, I think, was like the third or fourth highest paid player in the league, even though he's been washed for a few years. Very, very financially mismanaged team under their former sporting chief, Fabio Paratici, who of course went to Tottenham, and I'm not actually sure if he's still working for Tottenham or not after the kind of the legal issues he's had there. No one seems to know, but I think he's still got some input there. He mismanaged the club, and the wage bill was way too high. So they've got rid of Chiesa as well. He was another big, very, very big earner. So they've got the wage, but the players that they brought in are not on those kind of high salaries, and they are generally younger players with players who can improve and become hopefully top players. And then if they do choose to sell, because we know that Serie A unfortunately is a selling league now, that there's the potential for their values to increase. So Juventus have been very financially prudent in their long-term vision going forward now.
Is it harder then, obviously, for other teams in Serie A to be as prudent, or to spend the same sort of money, maybe, or to be as clever in the market, because of this TV rights issue that we've obviously talked about before on the podcast with Duncan and the Ligue 1 rights? But I know you've been kind of across the Serie A rights, and there's kind of been problems there too, hasn't there? They're not getting the same amount of money they used to.
Oh, it's a total disaster. It's been the mismanagement in Serie A. I mean, I know it's bad in Liga, but Serie A gives Liga a run for its money for financial mismanagement with TV rights. It's embarrassing. I mean, the number of big markets across the world, which Serie A, even still today, 4 match days into the new season, they still haven't secured TV deals for some of these big markets. And we're looking at markets like Malaysia, like France, like all across the world. Like when the season started, a couple of days, because we did a big show on this on the Italian Football Podcast a couple of days before the season started, and there was no TV rights in England, in Australia, in India, in Indonesia. It just huge markets, most of Scandinavia, South America. Eventually, they did manage to do some last-minute deals in some of these markets, but the value of these deals was pathetic. The actual deals themselves, like not OTT, over the top OTT. In India, they did a deal where you could only watch the games on your computer. You couldn't watch it anywhere else. There was not even a working app. It was on like an esports app. In England, the TV rights is split between two games being shown on TNT and then the other 8 having to watch them on one football, but you're having to pay $4.99 per game. So if you wanted to watch all of the other 8 games, you'd have to pay £40 a match day plus TNT to watch the other 2 games. I mean, nobody's going to pay that. And then, of course, like I said, the value of these TV deals have plummeted. Like the United States, the TV deal has the value of that deal has we don't know the exact figures, but I know that it's gone down massively. So it's just been really mismanaged. And I know also, speaking to people around the world, that like this is how bad SerieA is at negotiating. Like they only open talks with most of these markets like 2 or 3 weeks before the SerieA season started. So like in Australia and Indonesia and all these markets around the world, they only start opening talks about selling the TV rights 2 or 3 weeks before the SerieA season started in August. So I mean, what hope is there when there's mismanagement like that?
Yeah, it's crazy. You've come a far way from watching Channel 4's Football Italia in the 1990s and waiting to hear the latest headlines from Gazzetta being read out to us on a highlight show. But you would hope that things will get better, but I'm not confident it will. And do you see that then having a long-term effect on transfers into Italy from other countries? It'll make the kind of pulling power and the money and the financial clout that Italian clubs will be able to spend on transfers in January and next summer. We'll see fewer and fewer big transfers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I could sit here and deny that's the case because I'm trying to promote SerieA, but unfortunately it's not. We have to be open and honest. And you know, we've seen with England, the reason why the Premier League is so much better and so much richer than every other league is because of its TV rights deal. And you know, every single rights cycle there is, the SerieA rights cycle, the value drops, the number of markets that the league is sold to decreases. I mean, when the next rights cycle comes along in a few years, you know, my concern is that SerieA is going to be even more like France. We've seen France. I think France didn't sell, you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Liga didn't sell its TV rights to Italy, to England.
I think Robin and Duncan will be able to correct us and give us.
I think it's about 3 of the big 5 leagues it didn't sell the TV rights to. My concern is that that's going to be Italy in a few years. That, you know, maybe they don't sell the SerieA doesn't sell its TV rights to who knows, even to England if they're struggling to sell it this time. You know, so that's the concern.
Yeah, hopefully things can improve, obviously, and or they can find good value both sides, the TV companies, the football clubs, and then we'll see good players going to these clubs. But I say Italian clubs always know how to keep their head above water and sign the next big thing and bring great players through, and they have a great loan system to get players experience in the lower divisions. So hopefully we will see the Italian league continue to grow for your sake and your podcast's sake and this podcast's sake, obviously. But I think the main thing that I took out of this conversation is that you admitted that the Premier League is better than the other leagues in Europe. You may not have meant it in that way, but I think we can clip it up and then we can bully you and use it against you for all eternity.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, like we all do it. We like to mock the Premier League sometimes, you know, the media and everything. But when it comes to competently running the league organisationally, and when it comes to TV rights, that there is no league better. And when you see the likes of the way that France and Italy and other leagues do it, they're way off.
Thanks very much for your time, Carlo. I hope the listeners enjoyed your insight and expertise on Serie A, and hopefully Juventus can have a good season for you.
Yeah, I think they will. I think they will have a good season. I don't know how well they will do, but I think Juventus are definitely going to be. They've got a great coach, Thiago Motta. That is one thing that Juventus have. They've got one of the best young coaches in Europe. So hopefully he can do some special things for them.
Cheers. Thanks, Carlo.
Thank you.
Well, Ronan's no longer on hosting duties because he's the one going to be answering the questions from me now about the state of the Bundesliga transfer market in the summer. Ronan, any clubs that were kind of spending money in the Bundesliga, it always seemed to be a case of them recouping the money first before they would go and spend. and that kind of led to a bit of a depressed market overall, probably with the exception of Bayern, of course. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think that's what you generally find in the Bundesliga and in German football in general, that teams kind of sell to buy. And then if you look at the net spend of any team, apart from Bayern Munich or Dortmund, say, there's no one kind of spending more than their means. They're outspending. Amazingly, Hoffenheim are the only team outside Bayern and Dortmund who have a net spend of more than 10 million euro this summer, because that's the way German clubs operate. And that's kind of the model they have in Germany with the 50+1 rule, because these teams, with the exception of the super clubs and Leipzig, that they don't have the same kind of finances because they're fan-owned or fan-governed at least. They don't have these huge sponsorships. They don't have these billionaire owners. So Hoffenheim, in the past, they've had this billionaire owner, millionaire owner, the owner of SAP, Dietmar Hopp, who is a controversial figure in German football, because he used to be outside the 50+1 rule because he brought Hoffenheim up from the lower divisions, backed them heavily financially, and they are looking now to return to the 50+1 model, and there have been protests around the club that this hasn't happened, and they're the only team that have actually had a big spending of more than 10 million net spend. 11 million they've spent more on transfers than they've taken in. But every other team across the Bundesliga has kind of broken even or kept it close, and you haven't got these kind of levels of big spending that we see maybe in other leagues, where teams kind of mortgage the future and hope for success. German teams tend to play their cards close and keep their money and finances in order, and that's obviously great for the Bundesliga. But we've also not seen huge names come in this summer. We haven't seen huge names go out. It hasn't been a very busy summer for big transfers at all in the Bundesliga.
So how does that reflect on Leverkusen's chances of them retaining their Bundesliga title? Did they manage to hold on to the main players, and did they make any astute signings in that could offset anyone they lost?
Yeah, I think I was over in Leverkusen for the Super Cup, and Fernando Caro, the CEO, and Simon Rolfes, the sporting director, spoke about why they did what they did this summer, and it was more a case of wanting to keep the players and the squad together and build on a few key areas, but not necessarily make wholesale changes or strengthen where they needed to. And they admitted that they were in a different market now than they used to be. They used to be able to buy a younger sort of a player and kind of help him develop and progress through the ranks. But now, when they're German champions, they're playing in the Champions League, they're competing in a higher market for a different level of player. So they only actually made 3 big signings this summer. Martin Terrier coming from Rennes, and Velocian as well from Rennes, and then Alex Garcia in midfield. So what they've done is bring in one player in each kind of level, one defender, one midfielder, one forward, to offer squad depth, and they haven't really lost any key players. So keeping together the squad and keeping Xabi Alonso there was obviously the biggest thing for Bayer Leverkusen. But because of the extra games, like you mentioned when we were talking about the Premier League in the Champions League that they have, you saw it last season when they got to the latter stage of the season. They just looked exhausted against Atalanta in the Europa League final. They weren't able to keep up with Atalanta's pace, their press, anything like that. So it'll remain to see whether just investing for one player in each position can actually work out for them in the long run, because if they get injuries or they have kind of problems with squad depth, it's going to show very quickly, because Leverkusen don't have a hugely deep squad, and the players maybe coming up, or the players on the fridges, won't be able to compete at the same level that we saw Leverkusen compete last season.
And what about Bayern then? A bit of a comprehensive across the squad spend this summer after the disaster of last year, relatively. We're recording this the morning after they smashed Dynamo Zagreb 9-2 in the Champions League. So is everything as rosy in the garden as that result suggests, or is there still a bit of bedding in for some of these players for Vincent Kompany? Yeah,
I think there's a bit of both. I think obviously they would have liked to maybe strengthen a bit more than they had, and they still seem to be weak at right back, because Sacha Boey has been playing at right back for the first few games of the season. He's out now for the next 4 to 6 weeks, and then they're trying to figure out what they can do at right back. They play Kimmich there in the Champions League, but he doesn't want to play in right back. Kompany probably doesn't want him to play in right back, so they still don't have the level of squad maybe that they want to compete. And obviously people will point to the fact they sold one of their key fullbacks to Manchester United, Mazraoui. He wasn't a huge success at Bayern Munich, but his versatility offered kind of great cover for a team like Bayern Munich, who want to win the Champions League, expect to win the Bundesliga. The last season was a disaster for them. So Kompany, like the minimum expectation for him will be to win the Bundesliga, and then he'll be expected to get to the semi-finals or the final of the Champions League. But if you don't have a fit first choice right back, it doesn't really speak well for the way you've acted in the market so far.
And what about the rest of the supposed challengers, your Leipzigs, your Dortmunds? Any interesting deals done there which could make a difference come the end of the season?
Yeah, I think Dortmund should be probably stronger this season because they have a better coach, in my opinion. Nuri Sahin came in at the second half of last season. He was known as kind of more a tactical coach, a more kind of modern coach than Edin Terzic had been. And Terzic, although he was nominated for World Manager of the Year, World Coach of the Year, whatever it is, for getting Dortmund to the Champions League, I think a lot of people on the outside, or even fans of Dortmund, would have admitted that he overachieved in the Champions League because his results in the Bundesliga were very inconsistent. They only ended up coming fifth, and they only qualified through the back door for the Champions League this season. So they've had to make huge moves. They've made a big change in the dugout in the manager, but they've also brought in new strikers, which I think is an upgrade on what they had. Füllkrug was obviously a big sale to West Ham, but then they turn around and get Guirassy from Stuttgart for 18 million, which could be one of the bargains of the summer of the money they paid for him, because once he starts scoring, he's only after returning to fitness. Once he starts scoring and getting among the goals, he could be a huge player for them. They've also then signed Maxi Bayer from Hoffenheim. He was considered one of the kind of best young talents in Germany. He could be the future Germany number 9, because Germany are a country who are crying out for a number 9. Timo Werner, we remember the kind of failed experiment there. So they're still looking for a number 9. So I think Dortmund should be much better in attack than they were. They seem to be better at the back than they were last season. I think that's coaching rather than necessarily signing so far, although Valdemar Anton is a clever move from Stuttgart. So I think Borussia Dortmund will be much better this season. They probably won't get to the Champions League final again, obviously, but I think they'll be a much better team. Whereas Leipzig, they haven't made huge signings, and they never really do make huge signings, but they tend to bring in kind of talented young players on reasonable fees. They didn't spend more than 21 million on a player. That was Nusa from Bruges, and he scored in his debut. He kind of hit the ground running. They got Gertruda from Feyenoord for 20 million. They're kind of looking to the future with some of the signings, and it's a developmental club. They're not really going to win the Bundesliga, but they can knock on the doors, and they can compete in the Champions League and get to the knockout stage. And the biggest signing for them was to keep Xavi Simons at the club rather than lose him, because there was obviously a chance he was going to move on a permanent fee elsewhere, and they were happy enough to take him on loan with no option whatsoever of buying him at the end of the season, just because he's that talented a player. And it's great that he's back in the Bundesliga, but he could have another huge season, and that will kind of only increase his value more for PSG when they do sell him next summer. Obviously, this summer's transfer market in the big 5 leagues was down a bit compared to last season, and Paul talked about it earlier. But Paul, Saudi Arabia, they kind of left it late to make some of the signings. They waited till the transfer market was closed in some other countries before they made moves, and they didn't really have the old guy moving to Saudi Arabia that we've seen in the past. And I think, are we seeing kind of a more clever transfer idea or approach from them?
I think I would agree with that. There's various suggestions why that might be the case. They might have focused on other areas or other sporting developments. Obviously, they have the PIF, whether it's publicly known or not, they do have a stake in Newcastle, so there was focus there, and maybe that's taken the focus off the league. Or they've been involved with Live Golf, they're doing stuff with boxing, so the spread of spend is wide, and I think this summer they've tried to be a bit more sensible. If you look at how much they've been paying a guy like Neymar, for example, to basically sit in the stand or go back to Rio for the carnival, or basically sit in the gym and say that he's not fit, I think the Saudis have learned a harsh lesson there, that these guys are coming at the end of their career and don't have many options in Europe for a reason, because quite a lot of them have a lot of miles on their legs, and they might not be the players that they once were. So I think there is going to be a strategy going forward where they pick up younger talent. And you've seen that, I think probably the best deal that the Saudis did this summer was Moussa Diaby, who's a guy who was very much in his prime after playing for Leverkusen and then doing reasonably well for Aston Villa in the Premier League. So I think Diaby's either 25 or 26, so that's prime of his career. You would say that was probably the best deal that they did. And rather than wasting money chasing a lot of guys who are reaching the end of their career, they chose to be smart about it. And even they chose not to get ripped off, you would suggest, in the case of Osimhen. I wonder if Osimhen had wanted to go to Saudi last summer, whether that deal would have went down and he would have been paid ungodly sums of money to go there. But I think that in the case of Osimhen and the demands that he put on any club looking to buy him, I just think that scared off even the Saudis in terms of what they want to spend. So I wouldn't say that it's prudent, because they can still offer extravagant wages at virtually 0% tax. So there is that element of it where they can go big if they want to. But I think they're just looking to assess and say, can the players that we're bringing in make this league better, make the quality of the league better, and therefore make it a more attractive product around the world? And I think that they decided that there just weren't that many deals out there this summer that would allow them to do that. So it is refreshing, and it means that the approach is a bit more focused and less scattergun. Certainly there was last summer, and certainly less scattergun than people might have believed that it would be over the next couple of years, where players and agents might have thought there was an easy payday for them in the future that might not necessarily be there anymore. And then the final point is, obviously, from a player perspective, there are some players that just don't want to go. If you look at the case of what Ronald Koeman told Steven Bergwijn, you're not playing for the national team anymore because you're playing in Saudi, and I don't rate that league whatsoever. And I think guys in that 25, 26, 27-year-old range who do have an international future and do want to continue to play might be a bit scared that their coach might not consider the Saudi league, the type of competition in which merits an international call-up. So there's a number of factors at play, but at the very least, the Saudi spending has reflected an overall downturn in the market.
Yeah, I think we're kind of seeing that the only place that was willing to make a move on Osimhen this summer was the Turkish league, but they didn't actually spend huge money. This is a loan move. It was the only place he kind of ended up going, because we spoke about it obviously with Duncan in the past. The finances, the money that Napoli were looking for him seems to be kind of 2023 transfer fees and things like that rather than 2024. So he's ended up in Turkey. He's obviously got an assist on his debut. He set the Turkish Super League record for the most shots in a match, I think, as well, or shots on target in a match. So we'll see how that goes for him. But that seems to be one where he's not going to command the same fee even in January or next summer or whenever. His value will continue to decline. And I think Turkish clubs as well, they were linked with a lot of players, but they weren't necessarily hugely active in the market like we've seen in every other league we've discussed on the show so far. But they did actually break the Super League record this summer. Of Fenerbahce signed Yusuf En-Nesyri from Sevilla for 19.5 million euro, and that was the most ever spent by a Turkish club. But if you look at the way that even that fee is kind of structured, they're not kind of putting all their eggs in one basket, because that 19.5 million has actually been paid in 8 installments over the next 4 years. So they've spread the cost of that transaction over 4 years. So I think clubs around the world, not just in the big 5 leagues, but in Saudi Arabia, like you said, and in Turkey, seem to be kind of more clever about how they're going about their business. And we'll probably continue to see that for the next few transfer windows as well.
The one objection to that rule, if you go back to England, is Birmingham. If the regular listeners don't know, Birmingham are a League One side now in England, which is the third tier, and they spend almost 30 million euros this summer on players to win the third tier of English football. Time will tell whether that was a wise spend, but at least half of that, if not more, was on one player, Jay Stansfield, who came in from Fulham. He was on loan there last season, did really well. A player who is clearly going to be above League One level at some point in his career, whether he's there just now or not. That's a quite staggering deal for a third tier team in English football. And as most of us may or may not know, they are an American-backed consortium with Tom Brady involved, and it's all culminated in them playing Wrexham at St Andrews on Monday night, and it felt like It felt more like Monday Night Football from America than it did from the Premier League, put it that way. So the Birmingham spending is the one exception to the rule. I don't think they had to spend that type of money to get out of that league, but they have. And we'll see if it actually turns into promotion, because League One is not a particularly easy league to get out of, even for teams dropping down from the Championship. And we'll see if that spend actually gets them where they need to be and matches the ambition of the owners.
Yeah, hopefully it'll turn out to be a wise investment, or maybe if you're a fan of every other club, you might hope that it backfires horribly on them, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. So I think that's covered everything. Thanks very much for your time and for stepping into co-hosting duties for part of it this week, Paul. It's been much appreciated.
No problem, anytime, Ronan.
You've been listening to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com. If you liked what you heard, please follow us on your favourite podcast platform and give us a rating or a review. Your support helps build a bigger audience and bring you more news, analysis and insight. You can also follow and message us on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Transfers Podcast. Our Twitter address is @TransfersCast. Paul is Paul Macdonald FC and I'm @SwearI'mNotPaul on Twitter. Our production is by Mark Caulfield at Pro Podcast Production, and our music is by Mark Caulfield and David L. Stay safe, be well, and thank you for listening.